In 1900, at the very tail end of Queen Victoria's long reign, in the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, West Africa, a British governor demanded to sit on a stool to show his authority over the local Ashanti people. But the problem was that this was no ordinary stool. Inlaid with gold, it was not merely a political throne, but a sacred symbol too. And his demand would ignite a rebellion not led by a king or a general, but by a 60-year-old Queen Mother. This is the story of the War of the Golden Stool. The war, fought in 1900, was the fifth and final conflict between the West African Kingdom of the Ashanti and the British Empire. And whilst British redcoats fighting in the jungle might spring to mind, most of the British troops in this war, apart from the officers and NCOs, were actually local Africans from Britain's neighbouring colonies. The Kingdom of the Ashanti in modern-day Ghana was actually a sophisticated confederation of tribes, established in the early 18th century by their first king, Osei Tutu. He developed a highly disciplined army that became the scourge of his neighbours, and the Ashanti became the dominant power in that part of West Africa. Early on in his reign, during a gathering, the high priest called down the golden stool from heaven. Supposedly, the stool landed, gently, in the king's lap, confirming his authority as leader of the confederation. As its name suggests, it was inlaid with gold. But it wasn't the precious metal that made it worth fighting a war over. Stools in Ashanti culture were a symbolic right to lead. But the golden stool was more than that. It was the spiritual link between the living, the dead, and those to come, as well as between the king and his people, and between each clan and the state. Whoever controlled the stool effectively controlled the state. The British presence on the Gold Coast of West Africa had originally been confined to a series of forts on the coast, from where they had transported slaves across the Atlantic. And many of those slaves were supplied from prisoners captured in their wars by the Ashanti. The first clash between the two sides came in the 1820s, when the Ashanti tried to extend their control all the way to the coast, including those forts. That very first war had ended in Ashanti triumph, with the British governor, Sir Charles McCarthy, killed, and his head taken to the Ashanti capital of Kumasi, where his skull became part of a gold-rimmed drinking cup. Before I go on, I just want to thank HelloFresh for sponsoring today's show. Now, I recently discovered them, well actually Sarah did, so credit where it's due, and it's been a real game changer, enabling me to eat healthy meals whilst cracking on with producing my history shows. I love the fact that my meals are delivered to my door and include all the ingredients I need, so no mad rushes down to the supermarket. And because they send just the amount you need, no wastage either. Each meal comes with a recipe card and is contained in its own bag. And you can choose how many meals you want each week and for how many people, so real flexibility. And that flexibility also allows you to pause for holidays and to cancel whenever you want. Click on the link appearing now or in the description and use the exclusive code THC50 to get 50% off your first box, along with a 20% discount on the following 2 months, plus free desserts for life. Or you can scan the QR code. And now, back to the story. 40 years of peace came to an end in 1863, when the Ashanti again crossed the Pra River, which acted as the border with the British colony of the Gold Coast. However, the war then ended in stalemate, with both sides losing more men to disease than to fighting. The Third Anglo-Ashanti War, which began in 1873, saw British General Sir Garnet Wolseley march all the way to Kumasi, winning several battles en route, before ransacking and burning a large part of the capital. The two sides agreed a peace treaty, and Wolseley returned to the coast and a career that would include the commanding of the British conquest, in all but name, of Egypt, and the failed expedition to rescue Charles Gordon in Khartoum. The Ashanti, having agreed to pay reparations of 50,000 ounces of pure gold, continued to live outside the British Empire. However, the Confederation could not escape the growing European scramble for Africa, and it wasn't just the British who were eyeing up their lands. To the west, the French were closing in on their borders as they expanded their colony in the Ivory Coast. At the same time, to their east, the Germans had established the colony of Togoland. If that worried the Ashanti, it certainly worried the British. Not only did they consider the Ashanti, after 3 wars, as sort of part of their sphere of influence, but they also wanted to prevent their European rivals getting their hands on the Ashanti's palm oil and mineral resources. Following a series of civil wars between rival claimants to the throne, Prembe I was finally crowned King of the Ashanti in 1888. For the next 8 years, he played a diplomatic game trying to ward off the Europeans, in particular the British, who wished to establish a protectorate over his kingdom. Now, I don't want to get into the history or the finer points of protectorates, but at a top line, they were a popular tool for Europeans to extend their control during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, not just in Africa, but in Asia too. Fundamentally, the European power would offer to protect a weaker state in exchange for control over their external and indeed some internal affairs. Normally, they placed a diplomat in the capital who wielded considerable influence and indeed power over the local ruler. So, whilst nominally independent, a protectorate had lost considerable sovereignty and couldn't act against their protector's wishes, in particular making treaties with other countries. They were a colony in all but name. A point that was not lost on the Ashanti king, who politely but deftly swatted away British requests until 1896. In that year, the British finally lost patience and dispatched an expeditionary force under Robert Baden-Powell, future founder of the Boy Scout movement, to Kumasi to convince Prempeh that a British protectorate was a great idea after all. They also pointed out that the reparations agreed way back in 1874 still hadn't been paid in full. When Prempeh refused to pay the outstanding reparations and also refused the British offer of protection, he and about 30 of his key supporters and chiefs were exiled to the British colony of the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean. He would remain the king across the water for nearly 30 years. This so-called Fourth Anglo-Ashanti War, which was hardly a war at all, resulted in the British establishing their desired protectorate, and a diplomat called Resident installed in Kumasi. This resident, Cecil Armitage, also built a fort in the Ashanti capital, which was garrisoned by a small force of British African troops, principally from Nigeria. Unsurprisingly, the Ashanti resented the removal of their king and the enforcement of this British protectorate. But whilst the British believed that they were in charge, the Ashanti begged to differ. The king may be exiled, but the very symbol of the nation was still very much at large, the golden stool. The Ashanti saw the potency of the golden stool to their resistance to British rule, and the British saw it likewise. Outside of their control, it was a symbol of resistance. In their clutches, it symbolically would tell the Ashanti people who was the new boss in town. So the British resident now set out on an almost holy grail search for the golden stool, whilst the Ashanti kept one step ahead, moving it to secret locations. Finally, after searching in vain, Cecil Armitage contacted his boss, the governor of the Gold Coast, Sir Frederick Hodgson, asking him to add his weight in the matter. 49-year-old Hodgson was the son of a Dorset rector and was the former Postmaster General in British Guiana, now Guyana, who'd been in West Africa for well over a decade. In 1888, he was appointed Colonial Secretary of the Gold Coast, effectively Deputy Governor, before stepping up to the top job 10 years later. Now, with that experience, you might think that he would understand the Ashanti and their feelings towards the golden stool. However, Hodgson was a man very much of his age, bombastic, grave, and full of both his own superiority and that of the empire he served. Arriving in Kumasi with his wife and a small guard, on the 25th of March 1900, he addressed the leaders of the Ashanti dignitaries, and whilst they politely listened, he lectured them with these words. Your King Prempeh I is in exile and will not return to the Ashanti. His power and authority will be taken over by the representative of Queen Victoria. The Queen is entitled to the stool. She must have it. Whilst hectoring in tone, his demand probably wasn't a shock to the Ashanti. After all, they knew the British wanted the golden stool. That's why they had been successfully hiding it from them. But it was what he said next that would lead to a war. A war that would cost hundreds of lives. Hodgson continued, Where is the golden stool? I am the representative of the paramount power. Why have you relegated me to this ordinary chair? Why did you not take the opportunity of me coming to Kumasi to bring the golden stool to me to sit upon?" His demand was met by a stunned silence. No one sat on the golden stool, not even their king. It was a sacred object. And now this mere governor, on behalf of Queen Victoria, wanted to plonk his white backside on it. You can imagine what was going on in the minds of the gathered Ashanti. Incredibly, based upon that faux pas, the meeting ended quietly and peacefully. But Hodgson had completely failed to read the room. That night, the shocked and angry Ashanti chiefs met to discuss the demand. And whilst they debated and debated and debated, a woman took to the floor and galvanised them into action. Ya Asantewa was the Queen Mother of Ajusi, one of the village states in the Ashanti Confederation. Now in her 60s, she goaded the men into resistance with a speech that rivals Queen Elizabeth I's speech to her troops before the Spanish Armada. How can a proud and brave people like the Ashanti sit back and look while white men take away their king and chiefs and humiliate